Welcome back to the training suite of the Joint Intersectoral Analysis Framework, or short, the JIAF. The training suite consists of 3 elements: 4 high-level pre-recorded presentations of about 20 minutes, 8 more in-depth blended sessions of about 30 to 40 minutes, including exercises, and additional technical workshops and webinars. The 4 high-level sessions provide a broad overview of the JIAF and an introduction to its concept, methodology, and process. The 8 in-depth blended sessions dive into more detail of the framework, the indicators and severity, aggregation and PIN. They look at the process in more detail in terms of coordination setup and look at the process step by step. They look at best practices from the JIAF 1.1 and provides an overview to intercluster coordinators, HPC focal points, and country cluster coordinators. This is presentation 7 of the 8 blended learning sessions. This session looks at the relationship between the JIAF and the HPC and is for intercluster coordinators and OCHA HPC focal points. The session's objective are to describe the relation between JIAF and the HPC, help determine how the JIAF analytical process fits into the intercluster work plan, and provide suggestions on how to adapt the standard agenda of the HPC kickoff workshop to the local context. So, how do the JIAF and the HPC relate or link? We're going to look at 2 dimensions of relation, in particular process and structure. Let's look first at the process. This means initiating the process around June, agreeing on the scope of the analysis and the costing approach, conducting the secondary data review, collecting data, compiling the evidence base should take place during July and August. The joint intersectoral needs analysis will then have to take place between July and September. Starting in September, the work on the HRP should begin, defining the scope of the HRP and formulating initial objectives. Following this rough timeline should enable operations to meet the key dates and deliverable this year. Namely, the inputs from country offices on 2nd of November, regional inputs are 1 week later on 9th of November, all this to enable the aforementioned launch of the GHO on 2nd of December. So, let's now go back to the JIAF. Here we see the 5 key steps of the JIAF process. Step 1, plan and design a joint intersectoral analysis process. Step 2, collate and collect data. Step 3, consolidate the JIAF data. Step 4, conduct the JIAF analysis. And then the final step 5, validate the analysis. These 5 steps should, when possible, align with the HPC global timeline. That is, if the analysis of the JIAF is meant to inform an HNO, which is usually the case. In fact, in many cases, the JIAF process is the same as the process to develop an HNO. To illustrate the similarity of the JIAF and the HPC process, let's take a look at the step-by-step HPC guidance. Here we see on this slide the main key steps to develop an HNO. And you will note they are indeed quite similar. Step 1, agreeing on the scope of the analysis for the H&O and the costing approach for the HRP. Then further analysis, undertake a secondary data review, plan and collect primary data, and conduct a joint intersectoral analysis. Before then moving into the HRP side, where it's about defining the scope of the HRP, formulating the initial objectives, conduct a response analysis, and then finalize the strategic and specific objectives, all informed by the analysis done for the H&O. So let's zoom into a bit more detail to illustrate this point further. Here we see step 1, agreeing on the scope and the focus of the analysis. In this step, one adapts the H&O analysis framework, which is the same as the JIAF analysis framework in most cases, and to develop an analysis plan based on the key questions needed to inform planning and decision making. In step 2, it's all about looking at the data that already exists and making sense of it. In this step, it's about compiling the evidence base, further refining the timeline for the delivery of the analysis results, agree on roles and responsibilities, and then actually do the analysis of the secondary data. Based on the review of existing information, one can then identify information gaps and determine how to bridge those most efficiently. After these steps have been done, this is when the collection of primary data begins. In many cases, this could be an MSNA or similar exercises to collect primary data in the field. After existing information has been consolidated and information gaps addressed to our best abilities through collecting primary data, that is when then one brings all the information together to conduct a joint intersectoral analysis. In this step 4, one analyzes also the risks and arrives at projections. One identifies further indicators to monitor the situation and needs, and finalizes the calculation of current and projected number of people in need. In the same step, one writes up the draft analysis results and presents those to the ICCG or the AHCT to validate and seek endorsement from them. After concluding this, in theory, one should have the information to help inform the planning stage. In reality, the planning might start also in parallel. However, maintaining a little bit the sequence of this proposed HPC timeline should help guarantee that the planning is truly evidence-based and informed on the analysis, rather than being supply-driven or disconnected from the analysis that has been done. To illustrate this further, here is an example of a timeline, in this case developed for Ethiopia last year, to help illustrate how the key steps fit. Take a few minutes to look at this in more detail. Now, let's have a look at how the JIAF and the HPC relate in terms of their structure. As a reminder, let's look at how the JIAF and the H&O link. The H&O is where we present our findings from the JIAF process. The H&O illustrates the evidence base we developed using the JIAF that will then underpin the collective humanitarian response. The H&O structure is linear in its presentation and follows mostly the JIAF conceptual framework. The first three pillars of the JIAF, context, shock and impact, correspond to the sections 1.1, 1.2 and 1.3 in the H&O. The two key functions of the analysis of these first three pillars, context, shock and impact, are to set in the JIAF and define in the H&O the scope of analysis. The other main function is to enrich the analysis and influence the final conclusions of the H&O in terms of severity, pin and projections. The scope of analysis in the H&O, section 1.3, is where we present what people, areas and themes the H&O will focus on. In a way, it is the conclusion of the first three pillars of the JIAF and gives the evidentiary reasoning on what to focus on for the rest of the H&O. Pillar 4 in the JIAF and section 1.4 in the H&O form the analytical heart. This is where all the analysis comes together, linking back to context, shock and impact, and exploring how humanitarian conditions manifest themselves in the most vulnerable groups. To allow for a truly people-centered lens, this section should be organized by vulnerable groups. So, now please take a few minutes just to go through a short exercise to help clarify a bit more the relation between JIAF and HPC. The suggestion is to take the HPC timeline and steps as presented before. You can find them also in the resource folder. And look at them against your local planning and identify where you might have to adapt where necessary. In terms of structure, think about how the JIAF can help strengthen section 1.4. You can find further information and resources on this by consulting session 6 of the blended learning sessions, where we look at emerging good practice. When done with the exercise, you can unpause and continue with this presentation. So let's look a bit more in detail how the JIAF process would fit with your intercluster coordination work plan. Zooming a bit more into the slide, you see here a standard intercluster coordination group annual work plan. Here a sample from 2019. It's just a screenshot, so you don't see all the steps. You can, however, consult the full file in the resource folder. The exercise I would like to propose now is to take a few minutes to review your intercluster coordination work plan and see if it needs adapting to reflect the JIAF process steps. Or else you can use the sample work plan just showed in the previous slide and think about how that would need adapting to reflect the JIAF process steps. When you're ready, you can unpause the presentation before we move to the last element of this session. Okay, let's conclude this session by looking at a sample agenda for an inception workshop or an HPC kickoff workshop. Here you have a sample of a 2-day, well, 2 half days, in fact. This can take also other forms. Workshop can take a half day or a full day or even 2 full days depending on your local context and what you need to be addressing in this workshop. In this sample here, you see on the first day in the morning, after the introductions, there is a discussion on the main elements of the JIAF, and from there it continues on a discussion on cross-cutting issues and how to integrate gender, age and disability, PSEA and centrality of protection into the analysis. On the second day, there is some time scheduled to map the different evidence bases that feed into the H&O and looking at information gaps. From there on, the workshop moves into discussing HRB costing methodology and concludes by agreeing on the processes and timelines. Again, I would like to propose a short exercise before concluding this session. It's to think about how to adapt the sample workshop agenda, available also in the resource folder, to your local context. Take 5 to 10 minutes to think this through, and when you're ready, you can unpause the session. With this, we are at the end of this session, Blended Learning 7. We looked at the relation between the JIAF and the HPC in terms of process and structure. We looked at a sample intercluster work plan and reviewed it against a JIAF process. And we concluded by looking at a sample agenda for HPC kickoff workshop. For more information, please visit jiaf.info or consult our knowledge management platform. Many thanks for your attention.